Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture over 8th century prophecy, in which we'll talk about prophecy in general as a phenomenon in the ancient world. We'll also look at the biblical books of Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah chapters 1 to 12. First, let's address some preliminary issues, and let's start with how we normally define prophecy. So our word prophet stems from a series of Greek words that means something like one who proclaims or foresees. But the range of roles inhabited by individuals that we call prophets in the Hebrew Bible is pretty broad, as we'll see in just a minute. Secondly, prophetic activity was pretty common in the ancient Near East and was sometimes visionary in nature, in that visions came to certain individuals, sometimes divinatory in nature, in that sometimes individuals attempted to divine or predict events or circumstances through various means like animal sacrifices and extispacy, the reading of animal entrails. Sometimes prophecy was ecstatic, in that sometimes individuals had out-of-body migratory experiences in which their bodies might be possessed. As Paul Reddit notes in his text, Introduction to the Prophets, quote, Israel emerged in a context where persons could divine the will of the gods and even be possessed by them. In that same text, though, Reddit asks the question, what's different about the prophetic activity that we find in the Old Testament than that which we find in other witnesses from the ancient Near East? And he notes that there are two theological developments that set Israelite prophecy apart from ancient Near Eastern prophecy. First, the concept of monotheism, and second, that the prophets in the Old Testament insisted that God demands moral behavior from humans. Second, let's talk about the development of prophecy. In the texts that we have in the Old Testament, we see a number of different kinds of prophets and how those kinds of prophets and prophetic offices develop chronologically. So first, we might find a group of court prophets who often, but not always, are compliant with their king. We would expect, in other words, a court prophet to say anything that would make the king happy. But in Old Testament literature, we have several examples of court prophets who prophesy the exact opposite than what their monarch would like to hear. For example, the prophet Balaam in Numbers chapters 22 through 24, David's court prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 12, and the example of Micaiah ben Imlah in 1 Kings chapter 22. The second main development in prophecy after court prophets are itinerant prophets, like Elijah and Elisha that we hear about in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. These are prophets who are not attached to a specific court, but who instead wander around and who are almost uniformly critical of the powers that be. Also, in the case of Elisha, we seem to find an interesting development in that Elisha is a member of a prophetic guild, the sons of the prophet. Third and finally, the phase that we will discuss in the following lecture, the classic writing prophets. Prophets who have books ascribed to them that are, or purport to be, collections of their messages. And these are prophets like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, etc. This last and final phase starts in the 8th century. Finally, in terms of preliminaries, let's talk briefly about the nature and growth of prophetic books. In his book, The Prophetic Literature, An Introduction, David L. Peterson notes that, quote, the dominant model for understanding the composition of prophetic books is one in which various discrete units of discourse were preserved, collected, and edited. That is, the prophetic books in the Old Testament are not eyewitness accounts of what various prophetic figures actually said and did. Instead, they represent the endpoint of a long process of development, often by communities that felt strongly about the messages found therein. As we'll see, the best example of this process we'll mention in what follows is the book of Isaiah. Here we have a chronological list of kings from the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel that are mentioned in the prophetic books that we talk about in the lecture that follows. So I placed them here for your reference so that you can refer to them as needed. The first prophetic text that we'll examine in this lecture is the book of Amos, and we'll start by examining the historical background of the book of Amos. In any prophetic text, it's always helpful to examine what we call the superscription. That is, normally in chapter 1, verse 1, an editor will have placed a chronological statement that provides the parameters for the historical activity of a particular prophet. In the case of Amos, the superscription of the book tells us that Amos operated, quote, in the days of King Uzziah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. If this information is accurate, then these dates would place Amos's activity anywhere between 786 and 742. Most scholars would place Amos's activity more specifically between 760 and 750 BCE. We know a lot about the reigns of Uzziah and Jeroboam II. Under Jeroboam's reign, Israel enjoyed an era of economic prosperity. This period was also marked by peace and expansion for both Israel and Judah. Because of Jeroboam's annexation of Gilead and parts of Transjordan, Israel, quote, controlled the king's highway, which ran from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to the Gulf of Aqaba in Egypt, the major trade route in the area, and thereby reaped great wealth. However, as with Solomon and King Omri before him, Jeroboam II's reign was also marked by poverty and rural famine. Bruce Willoughby, in his work, notes that, quote, we can assume that Israel's domination of Gilead and the king's highway led to a prosperity that enveloped the royal family and prominent members of society, but did not trickle down to the poor. It is this uneven distribution of wealth in the 8th century that set the atmosphere for the social crimes that Amos so violently abhorred. And as you can tell on the left side of your screen, this is a map of Israel in the time of Amos, and in the text boxes you can see the geographical locations of all of the entities against which Amos prophesies in the first 2 chapters, which we'll talk about in just a second. All we know of the historical Amos is information we have from the book which bears his name. The bulk of our information concerning Amos comes from the encounter with Amaziah the priest in chapter 7, verses 10 to 17. In this passage, Amos tells Amaziah, quote, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman, and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. End quote. This passage seems to be straightforward. Amos is telling Amaziah that he's not a member of the Sons of the Prophets, the organization with which Elisha was associated, but that he's an independent prophet. Also, he tells Amaziah that the Lord personally conveyed to him a message to prophesy. The only problem is that the phrase, quote, I am no prophet, end quote, contains no verb in Hebrew, and thus can be taken as either past or present tense. If we read it as present tense, it may mean that Amos has broken with the sons of the prophets and is now acting on his own. On the other hand, if we read it as past tense, then it can mean that Amos wasn't a prophet when he was called, and as such had no specific training. Either way, it seems as if Amos is emphasizing his independence from the sons of the prophets as well as his call from the Lord. Also, we're told Amos was from Tekoa, which was a small fortress about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. It's also helpful to look at the titles or roles associated with Amos. He's variously called in Hebrew a noked, that is a shepherd or a sheep breeder, a boker, that is a herdsman or a cattleman, and a boles, that is a gouger or a scratcher, in this case, a gouger or scratcher of sycamore fig trees. Because of these agrarian titles, some scholars have assumed that Amos was a rural peasant, and that because of his socioeconomic situation, he identified with the poor and the homeless in a more profound way. Nowadays, most scholars don't think Amos was a poor peasant. First of all, the word boker, that is herdsman or cattleman, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible and in other ancient Near Eastern texts from Ugarit, refers to either a shepherd who owns his own sheep or an official who tended the royal herds. As James Mays notes in his commentary on Amos, quote, sheep breeder, that is boker, probably means an owner in charge of other shepherds, a substantial and respected man of his community. As such, Amos would not have been a poor herdsman. Second, since Amos is also called a boles, that is a gouger or a scratcher of trees, some scholars have thought that he was in the service of a wealthy landowner. Because of the connotations of boker, it's more likely that Amos was growing feed crops for his herds. Thus, he was tending his own trees. Third, and perhaps more obviously to non-Hebrew readers, the oracles in Amos chapters 3 to 6 contain references to political entities and cultic practices outside of Israel, and presumably Amos had to have been reasonably literate and intelligent to know of such places and practices. In conclusion, as Bruce Willoughby points out in his Anchor Bible Dictionary article on Amos, quote, Amos was a very gifted, highly educated individual, not a poor shepherd. Also, Amos was an economically independent, landed aristocrat who, believing that he had been called by the Lord, became a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. When we turn our attention to the book of Amos, we find that we can divide it fairly neatly into three main sections. The first section is found in chapters 1 to 2, and this is composed of various oracles against the nations. And as we'll see, each of these oracles has 4 points or 4 components in common. To illustrate this, we're going to examine the very first oracle that we find in the book of Amos, that is the example of Damascus in Amos chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. The components that we find in that oracle include the messenger formula, that is, the oracle is introduced by the phrase, "Thus says the Lord," in chapter 1, verse 3a. Secondly, these oracles include an indictment. So the messenger formula is followed by a stylized saying, quote, "For 3 transgressions of X and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." And we see this very clearly in Amos chapter 1, verse 3b. "For 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." Third, each oracle includes an announcement of the punishment, usually when the Lord sends some kind of fire against the offender. We see this in chapter 1, verses 4 through 5a. "I will send a fire on the house of Hazael, and it shall devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad," etc., etc. And finally, a concluding messenger formula. That is, each oracle ends with a statement, "Thus says the Lord." We see this in the oracle against Damascus in Amos chapter 1, verse 5b. These collections of oracles against the nations are interesting for us in order to understand the theological message of Amos because of their targets. In a previous slide, I included a map that illustrated specifically the geographical locations of the entities against which Amos was prophesying. In his work, A Short Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, John J. Collins uses the analogy of a pep rally to describe how the oracles might have been heard by Amos's original audience. So we can imagine them getting whipped up into a frenzy as he critiques Damascus, then Gaza, then Tyre, Edom, the Ammonites, and Moab. These last three would be especially relevant since these historically have been bitter enemies of the Israelites. If this is indeed a pep rally, you might imagine the confusion that his audience would have experienced when Amos pronounces an oracle of judgment against the southern kingdom of Judah in chapter 2, verses 4 to 5, and the northern kingdom of Israel in chapter 2, verses 6 to 16, an extended, long oracle of judgment. The audience would be confused because they would have assumed that Amos was one of them, was on their side. But as we see, Amos is operating with a very different sense of what we might call universal justice. And this is a key theme in these oracles against the nations. As Collins writes in his book, the grounds on which Amos pronounces sentence in these oracles aren't nationalistic, but rather humanistic. That is, Amos won't overlook the negative actions of his own people just because they're his own people. Collins writes, quote, "For Amos, the Lord is the God of all peoples and responsible for everything that happens, good and bad. In the eyes of God, therefore, Israel is no different than the Ethiopians or the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Moabites." This would have caused great consternation among Amos's audience. The second section of the book of Amos is found in chapters 3 to 6, and these chapters focus specifically on Israel. More particularly, these chapters target Israel's political center, Samaria, and its religious center, Bethel. As with the oracles against the nations, Amos's audience probably would have been confused, but also perhaps angry that Amos, a prophet from the south, had come all the way north to deliver such a negative message from the Lord to them about their practices. They might have thought, we're members of the covenant community, elected by God. How can we be in the wrong? But, as John Collins writes in his work, quote, "Election for Amos only means greater responsibility." In these chapters, we find three main themes. First, a theme that is prominent among all of the 8th century prophets, the theme of social injustice. And this is found in chapter 4, verses 1 to 4, where Amos addresses famously the cows of Bashan who were on Mount Samaria. Cows here in Hebrew is feminine, so Amos evidently is referring to upper class women who lounge around on their couches while the needy are being trampled in the street. Secondly, Amos also critiques the nobility's reliance on their religious observance. Amos's message here is fairly simple. Outward religious observance must be accompanied by an appropriate inward orientation. One cannot simply go through the motions of sacrificing to God. It's incumbent upon the one participating in a religious ritual to have an appropriate and correct inward attitude toward the ritual. Third, Amos critiques the expectation on the part of these Israelites for the day of the Lord, and this requires a little unpacking. This was traditionally thought to be a day of victory, a day when God would overthrow the enemies of God's people and vindicate the faithfulness of those in the covenant community. Amos, though, chastises his audience by telling them that due to their oppressive and negative actions, they have set themselves up as enemies of God. As such, they shouldn't desire the day of the Lord, because it's they who will be punished when that day comes around. Section 3 in Amos is found in chapters 7 to 9, and these chapters consist of 5 vision reports. And these 5 vision reports all follow basically the same pattern. And in order to illustrate that pattern, we're going to examine the 3rd vision, that is the vision of the plumb line that we find in Amos chapter 7, verses 7 to 9. All of these visions have what we might call an introductory formula. You find this in Amos chapter 7, verse 7a. This is what he showed me. Then the content of the vision, found in chapter 7, verse 7b here. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line, holding a plumb line in his hand. And third, we find a dialogue between Amos and the Lord. This is found in the example of the plumb line in Amos chapter 7, verses 8 to 9. The Lord said to me, "Amos, what do you see?" And I said, "Well, I see a plumb line." And the Lord said, "See, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by." So this is an oracle, a vision, that then leads to a pronouncement of punishment or destruction. We also have, in these chapters, the dialogue between Amos and Amaziah that we talked about a little bit earlier in chapter 7, verses 10 to 17, which provides us invaluable biographical information about the prophet. So, in conclusion, overall, what messages or what points can we find in the book of Amos? In his article, The Social Role of Amos's Message, Herbert Huffman summarizes that message in 4 related points. First, the socioeconomic lifestyle of the Israelites opposes traditional religious values. Second, socioeconomic reorganization without compassion is unacceptable. Third, the resulting oppression of the poor cannot be tolerated. And fourth, participation in the cultus gives a false sense of confidence. Overall, as we've seen, Amos's main theological emphases seem to be focused on the issue of justice and a condemnation of the religious cult as it's currently being run. Let's talk now about the book of Hosea. Again, when we ask questions about the historical background of Hosea, we gain a good knowledge of that background from the superscription of the book. It tells us that Hosea was active, quote, "in the days of King Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel." Based on these kings, who reigned from about 783 to 686, most scholars would posit a date for Hosea's activity somewhere between 750 and 722. That is, from the end of Jeroboam II's reign to the fall of Samaria and Israel in 722. In this time period, there were 6 kings besides Jeroboam II: Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and Hosea. And of those 6, 3 were assassinated, Zechariah, Shallum, and Pekahiah. 1 was deported after Assyria conquered Israel, and that would be Pekah. And the last king, Hosea, was an Assyrian puppet king who was later imprisoned after he tried to rebel against Assyria. Following this rebellion, Israel was completely conquered. Thus, the social situation for Hosea would have been very similar to that of Amos: uneven distribution of wealth, poverty, rural famine, urban wealth, etc. If we know very little of Amos's biography, we know even less of Hosea's. In fact, his name only appears 3 times in the book, in chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. As James Luther Mays points out in his commentary on Hosea, quote, "We do not know where his home was, what he did before he became a prophet, or how and when he was called to his mission. There can be, however, little question that he came from the kingdom of Israel and carried out his mission there. It is obvious from the quality of his sayings that Hosea was a man of ability and culture. He drew on the resources of wisdom, was skillful in using a variety of literary devices in the formulation of his speeches, and knew the historical traditions of Israel in depth. But there is no evidence that would aid in the reconstruction of his life before he became a prophet." End quote. The only other biographic information we're given about Hosea details his marriage and family with a woman named Gomer bat Diblaim. However, the chapters that deal with these relationships, that is chapters 1 to 3, are filled with symbolic imagery, prophetic drama, and metaphor. As such, I would have to agree with Mays when he writes that these chapters are, quote, reports of symbolic acts. And therein lies the problem. They were written to extend and expound the significance of Hosea's relation to the woman as a prophetic message from the Lord, but not to furnish data for a reconstruction of Hosea's biography. Thus it seems that when we talk of Hosea the person, we're pretty much left up to our imagination. When we turn to the book of Hosea, we find that, like Amos, we can divide this book into three main sections. The first section is found in chapters 1 to 3 and deals with Hosea's family. These chapters supposedly set up an analogous relationship between Hosea and his adulterous wife, on the one hand, and God and the people of Israel on the other. As Gail Yee notes, this metaphoric relationship may serve the writer's purpose in that it details how wrong the relationship between Israel and the Lord has become, but that service comes at a high price. Yee writes, quote, "As beautiful and profound as these religious images are, the human level on which they are based is very problematic for women. Growing out of a social structure and value system that privileged the male over the female, this metaphor makes its theological point at the expense of real women and children who were and still are victims of sexual violence. When the metaphorical character of the biblical image is forgotten, a husband's physical abuse of his wife comes to be justified as God's retribution against Israel." Along with this series of symbolic actions and prophetic drama, the central themes of section 1, that is chapters 1 to 3, include viewing the wilderness period, that is the period in which the people were wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus, as an ideal historical era, one in which God and the people lived in a more unified, unmediated state. Also, the claim that the covenant that God made with the people is conditional upon their behavior. That is, the people must obey the statutes and ordinances of Torah if they want to remain in the covenant community. Now, if that sounds familiar, it probably should, and many scholars have argued that there is the influence of the Deuteronomistic history here in section 1 of the book of Hosea. Section 2 is found in chapters 4 to 13, and these are oracles of judgment and hope. These chapters continue the theme of unfaithfulness which started in the first section. Israel will be judged for her sins, but hope can still be had if she acts quickly. According to James Mays, Hosea uses three themes in his oracles in order to make his message more urgent. First, his dialogue with the Canaanite fertility religion. In this regard, Hosea uses his familiarity with this religion to critique it and to offer it up as a discordant example over and against the religion of the Lord. Mays, in his work, calls Hosea the successor of Elijah in this respect, in that Elijah engaged in this kind of comparison as well. Second, his use of metaphorical images, especially the image of the unfaithful wife. By these metaphorical images, Hayes writes, quote, Hosea intensifies the personal quality of the Lord's relation to Israel. The normative history and the covenant are translated into a drama of persons in which the issues and values at stake are those of personal relations. Finally, Hosea's knowledge and use of history as a source of meaning for the future of Israel. That is, implicit in the history of Israel is the breakdown of its past into two eras, the time in the wilderness and the time in the land. As Mays writes, quote, the imminent action of the Lord proclaimed by Hosea was in a real sense a strategy calculated to blot out this second era, that is the time in the land, and to wrench the course of Israel's existence back into the first, that is, back into the wilderness period. By his punishment, the Lord would bring the career of faithlessness to a disastrous conclusion, so that it could not possibly continue. Then he would take the people back to their primary history, to the wilderness, where they would again learn to be his people. End quote. Other themes in section 2 include a critique of the cult that echoes Amos, a focus on politics at the expense of social justice, unlike what we saw in Amos, and a tender, compassionate image of the deity found in chapter 11 that we'll look at in just a moment. The third and final section of Amos is confined to one single chapter, that is chapter 14, and this chapter makes use of many natural and organic images to portray the reconciled relationship between the Lord and Israel. So what messages can we find in the book of Hosea? As I noted earlier, Hosea frames the relationship between the Lord and Israel in personal terms and within the confines of history. For Hosea, Israel can be redeemed, but only if she stops her relationship with Baal and the Canaanite religious practices. In contrast to Amos, Hosea doesn't emphasize justice and righteousness, but rather knowledge of God, devotion, and faithfulness. After Israel reconciles her relationship with the Lord, Mays writes, quote, the Lord will never again be confused with Baal. He will give them back the land and establish it as a sanctuary of peace. In that day of restoration, the Lord will completely preempt the role of Baal, endowing land and people with fertility. And it's fitting that we end our consideration of not only the message of Hosea, but also the book of Hosea by citing Hosea chapter 11, verses 8 to 9, which reads, quote, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Let's shift gears again from the book of Hosea to the book of Isaiah. And again, if we want to get a sense of the historical background, then we should begin by looking again at the superscription of the book. It reads, quote, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now, I mentioned earlier in this lecture that the book of Isaiah is undoubtedly one of the most complicated prophetic books in terms of dates and in terms of its history of composition. There's a wonderful example of that very problem in the first chapter of Isaiah, in that as we try to understand the period of activity for Isaiah, we have to recognize that this first chapter is undoubtedly a collection of early and later oracles. So because of this historical problem, scholars have instead looked to chapter 6 and its superscription to establish the beginning of Isaiah's activity. That chapter places Isaiah's call, quote, in the year that King Uzziah died, end quote, thus establishing a starting point for Isaiah's activity in around 742. If we look back at chapter 1, verse 1, for the end of Isaiah's activity, then we can posit a date of around 700. Thus, the historical situation behind Isaiah's activity revolves around a number of historical events. First, the Syro-Ephraimite War in around 732, which we'll discuss in more detail later. The activity of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. Israel's rebellion against Shalmaneser V. The rebellion of King Hezekiah. And Sennacherib's invasion of Judah in 701. Isaiah is undoubtedly the book that pays the most attention to matters of international politics. And to give you a reference for that, I make an offering of this map to you. May it be received kindly. When we look to the text to consider what aspects of Isaiah's biography we can extract, we're let down again. There's simply not much information about what we might call the historical Isaiah. In his classic introduction to the Old Testament, Otto Eisfeld commented on the life of Isaiah in the following typical German manner. Quote, concerning the prophet himself, apart from the name of his father, Amos, chapter 1, verse 1, we learn only that he was married to a wife who was apparently also prophetically gifted, and that by this marriage he had at least 2 children. She'er Jashub, that is, a remnant returns, and Maher Shalal Hashbaz, speed spoil haste booty, of which the first was, in 734 to 33, taken by Isaiah to his significant meeting with King Ahaz at the water conduit of the upper pool, and so was then presumably about 2 to 4 years old, and the second was born then. So far as we can tell, Isaiah appeared exclusively in Jerusalem, and since, on the evidence of his message, he is seen to be intimately bound up with city and temple, we may assume him to be a Jerusalemite. The widely held view, perhaps in some measure justified by the fact that he can make a request for service to men of importance, that he was of noble birth, perhaps even of royal descent, is, however, simply a guess. Now, what Eisfeld is trying to say in his convoluted German prose is that we can only guess as to the relationship between Isaiah and the political leadership of the country. While it seems as if he had some access to political leaders, it's not clear what role Isaiah might have played in relation to those leaders. We do know that Isaiah was given to fits of radical behavior in order to convince these leaders that their policy is wrong, as in chapter 20, but we don't know what effect, if any, this type of behavior had on them. In the end, we must assume that Isaiah had some pull with political leaders, but we can't really know what type of influence or even how much influence he would have had. When we turn to talk about the book of Isaiah, we have to acknowledge a fact that we have alluded to earlier, that is, that the book of Isaiah as we now have it in its 66 chapters is a composite book. That is, not all of those 66 chapters stem from the same author at the same time. The most common division of the book of Isaiah finds 3 distinct periods of activity. First, in chapters 1 through 39, the majority of those chapters especially chapters 1 to 12, can be dated with confidence to the 8th century. Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, on the other hand, are commonly held by scholars to be a product of the Babylonian exile, and as such are dated to the 6th century BCE. Finally, Isaiah chapters 56 to 66 contain material that stems from the post-exilic era, and as such probably stem from the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE. It's important that we keep in mind the composite nature of the book of Isaiah, especially when we're focusing on prophecy and prophetic literature of the 8th century, because that means that our focus is confined almost exclusively to the first 12 chapters of the book of Isaiah. If we focus on solely those first 12 chapters, we find two main sections of 8th century material. First, chapter 1, an introduction to the preaching of Isaiah. And this chapter, as I mentioned earlier, is a collection of various prophecies of Isaiah that was probably put together in the period of the exile in the 6th century. The second section, chapters 2 to 12, are prophecies of Isaiah concerning Judah and Jerusalem. This section contains many authentic prophecies from Isaiah from the 8th century that at times have been supplemented by a post-exilic redactor or editor. What I'd like to do is focus on two specific texts in section 2. First, I'd like to take a look at the call and the vision of Isaiah in chapter 6. In terms of genre, this is what we call a Merkava, or a throne vision, which will become a popular visionary genre in later biblical and Jewish texts like Ezekiel. Isaiah sees God sitting on a throne, attended by semi-divine beings. One of these brings a live coal and touches Isaiah's mouth with it, symbolically purifying it in preparation for the delivery of God's message by the prophet in what follows. Now, this purification is a common element in stories like this, and is even found in the Muslim account of the commissioning of Muhammad, in which a black spot was removed from the prophet's heart prior to receiving the revelations of God. Note also that Isaiah 6 follows several of the standard components in the call or commission narrative that we've examined before, such as in Exodus chapter 3 and 1 Samuel chapter 3. Finally, we should remember that God doesn't commission people in the abstract. That is, God always has a specific task in mind when calling someone. And here, that specific task has to do with King Ahaz and the Syro-Ephraimite War, which we'll discuss now. It's important to understand the encounter with Ahaz in chapter 7 and the Syro-Ephraimite War in its proper historical context. Pekah, the king of Israel from 736 to 732, wanted King Ahaz of Judah to join an anti-Assyrian alliance he'd founded with the king of Damascus, a fellow named Rezin. Ahaz refuses Pekah's request, and then Pekah and Rezin attack Judah and Jerusalem. It's at this point that Isaiah advises Ahaz to take no action, defensive or offensive, and to instead trust in the Lord. Isaiah even offers Ahaz a sign that all will be well if he takes his advice, and this sign is found in the famous text about Emmanuel in chapter 7, verses 13 to 17, which early followers of Jesus interpreted as a messianic prediction that was immediately applicable to their situation over 700 years later. Ahaz refuses to heed Isaiah's advice, at which point Isaiah announces that Assyria is going to be used by the Lord to punish Samaria and Damascus in chapter 8, verse 7, and in chapter 10, verses 5 and following. In the wake of Ahaz's refusal, we find a coronation song or a coronation poem celebrating the inauguration of a new king, one who will heed the prophet's advice and obey the statutes and the commandments of God. Historically speaking, this new king was probably Hezekiah, the king who succeeded Ahaz. Again, though, chapter 9, verses 2 to 7 have grown beyond their original historical confines, as early followers of Jesus took this section as a reference to him in the 1st century CE. When we ask about the message of Isaiah chapters 1 to 12, or the material in those chapters that we can reasonably date to the 8th century, we find 4 main themes. The first 3 of these should sound familiar, as they're all echoes of what we've heard in Amos. First, a rejection of the cult. Second, an emphasis on social justice. Third, an addressing of the day of the Lord. And finally, the character of God. This is a new wrinkle and as such requires a little unpacking. Isaiah floats the significant theological claim that God isn't simply interested in Israel. Rather, God is able to use Assyria as an instrument to chastise Israel for their refusal to heed Isaiah's word. As such, God's scope of authority is truly international, since all nations are under God's control and can be used by God for God's purposes. More broadly, though, let me quote again from Otto Eisfeldt's section on Isaiah. He writes, quote, "In the final analysis, Isaiah remained always constant in his message. Enthusiastic claims for the recognition of the sole majesty of the Lord and a passionate campaign against anything and everything which sets itself against that or attempts to obscure it, these are the characteristics of his proclamation from beginning to end." When we take a look at the books of Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah, all examples of prophetic literature stemming from the 8th century, it's proper for us to ask, are there any overarching themes that one can find in that century? Scholars like John J. Schmidt, in his Anchor Bible Dictionary article, have isolated various themes of pre-exilic prophets, like the ones we've just discussed, and he finds 4 of these themes. Theme 1 has to do with God, and Schmidt writes, quote, "The God whom the pre-exilic prophets experience is a God who demands certain actions from human beings. The 8th century prophets, like Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah, appear with a disturbing message. Israel has not lived up to its calling. The prophets see basic moral laws broken or ignored. The prophets proclaim that the God who stands behind those laws will come to uphold those demands." End quote. Also, these prophets demand that the people worship the Lord alone, and this worship must include altruistic and compassionate feelings and actions toward other humans. This worship stems from a sense of God's love for the people, expressed in God's revelation of the correct way to live in the sacred writings. The second theme Schmidt notes is the theme of Israel. He writes, quote, "The rise and history of prophecy in Israel virtually coincide with the history of the monarchy. It was the monarchy which allowed, perhaps even encouraged, the so-called Canaanization of Israelite culture, both socially and religiously. The development of social and economic ranks or classes in Israel led to the oppression of the poor and the needy. The rich grew wealthier, profiting from the labors and losses of the lower classes. The prophets decry this deterioration of Israel's soul. Because of these situations, the prophets proclaim that Israel has failed to live up to God's standards. In other words, the people have not respected the rights of God or other humans, and as a result, God will pass judgment on the people. The third theme that Schmidt finds is the relation between God and Israel. As you might imagine, these 8th century prophets saw a marked deterioration in the relationship between God and Israel because the people weren't responding to God's standards of behavior. The fourth and final theme is the future. There's a great debate over whether or not the visions of a future time in these prophets come from the prophets themselves or later editors of the books that bear their name. Either way, it's safe to say that the words of these prophets inspired either their immediate audience or their later followers to think of a future time when the people would follow the Lord's laws and act in an ethical manner toward other humans and toward the Lord himself. If you wonder whether or not those hopes for the future bore fruit, perhaps it's useful to look at the sculpture that I've included on this slide. This is a sculpture by the Russian artist Yevgeny Vuchetich titled "Let Us Beat Swords into Plowshares," and it comes from the concern of social justice in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. It was donated by the Soviet Union to the U.S. at the height of the Cold War in 1959 and now stands in front of the United Nations as a symbol for what nations can accomplish if they work together to seek the common good.